Hi everyone, it's Henry here, and in this video we're going to take a look at 3 different ways you could paint your Drukhari or Dark Eldar Kabalite warriors. We want a great looking result in a realistic time frame so we can get them on the table and get playing some games. To start with, I'll go through how I've approached the 3 different colour schemes, and then for all the additional parts we'll just stick to the one miniature, and I've painted it the same on all the models. So to begin with, I'm going to look at doing a Grayscale pre-shade, so starting from a black primer using Tamiya XF2 flat white. I've thinned this about 5 drops of X20A Tamiya thinner to paint, and I'm spraying about 25 psi using our Cold Paint Signature Series Infinity from Harder & Steenbeck with a 0.4mm needle and nozzle in it. So we're going to build up these thin layers of white paint over the black. That's going to create areas of light and areas of dark. I wanted this to be quite extreme on these Dark Eldar models, so I'm not really going for subtlety. And also means that there'll be areas of strong white and areas of really dark with not quite so much in that mid-tone that perhaps we might go for on other models. This is just because I wanted a higher contrast look for them, because I think it looks pretty cool. I picked a light source, so above and from the right as I look at the front, and the same from the back. As we build those layers of white up, we get a stronger light with some cool shadows, which you can see here. Now for the green scheme, I was going to use Incubi Darkness, and I'd practiced a Grayscale on this model, and I thought let's just see what Incubi looks like straight over it. So this is normal GW Incubi Darkness base paint. I've just thinned it with life colour thinner, about, 3 drops of thinner to paint until it's going through the airbrush without it speckling. And you can see it looks okay over the pre-shade, but it's not vibrant enough. So I'm going to do what I originally planned, which was to base coat the model with the Incubi Darkness, then go over it with a Tamiya white and effectively do a pre-shade. But this time, rather than starting from a black base, we start from an Incubi Darkness base. And I'm keeping these highlights really tight. At exactly the same manner, we work around the model, we pick a light source, again in this case from above and to the right as we look at the miniature. We just make sure that all those areas that the light would catch are nice and bright. And then over this green scale, I guess, or whatever you want to call it, we're going to use GW Terradon Turquoise contrast paint. Now I've thinned this about 1:1, again with just life colour thinner. You could use for layer thinner, whatever, it doesn't really matter. And I'm aiming predominantly at the areas that I have hit with the white. But if we get a bit of overspray, it doesn't really matter. So there's one coat. Not looking too bad. And we'll just slowly build the layers up until we get a nice, strong, vibrant turquoise colour. But our shadows have already got a little bit of interest in them because they were green to begin with. Now for our pink scheme, I've used Vallejo Model Air Red, which might sound a little bit misleading because I don't think it looks particularly red. And over our original Grayscale miniature, I've thinned this. Now my pot of this red needs less than 1:1 thinning. It goes through the airbrush really smooth at that 25 psi. And we just build it up. And then to bring a little bit more interest into the shadows, I'm going to grab Games Workshop Volupus Pink contrast paint, just like I did with the turquoise, thinned it 1:1, and I'm going to aim in the shadows. And the reason we've done this on this the pink version, and we did it on the turquoise version, is we don't just want those shadows, the pure black or the colour over the black. There needs to be something else there, otherwise it just looks a bit muddy, a bit desaturated. It's not what we're after. We want these Dark Eldar looking really vibrant, really weird. It's not the time for subtlety. Certainly not at this stage anyway. You can see once it's dried, much more interesting looking model. And the final scheme I wanted to do is for the Lords of the Iron Thorn Cabal. When I got back in the hobby about 10 years ago or so, the Dark Eldar book just come out, and I thought these guys looked awesome and I really wanted to do an army of them. Inevitably never got round to it, so I thought it'd be fun to do a take on them in this video. So I'm base coating it using Vallejo Game Air Sombre Grey. This is thinned 1:1, maybe ever so slightly more, and I'm building this up over the black primer so that I still get a couple of different tones of grey. So where there's only a thin coat in the shadows, the black is showing through a bit and making it darker. And to highlight it, I'm going to use Vallejo Game Air Wolf Grey. You can see both these greys have got a little bit of purple in them. I think it works really well for the Dark Eldar. And I'm focusing these highlights just like we did on the pre-shade. We pick a light source, we think where would that light hit on the model, and we make it lighter. It's nearly always going to be from above, and then you can choose an angle to make it a little bit more interesting. It doesn't have to be the same angle on the front and the back, because it's very difficult to look at both of those things at the same time. Again, we took about 3 or 4 layers here just to build up the highlight. Now to make it a bit more interesting, for the head I decided I was going to do a clear red scheme. So I've chosen a dark silver, in this case Metal Colour Series Gunmetal Grey. And I'm highlighting it using Vallejo Model Air Steel. Just like a white over a black, except this is a light silver over a dark silver. I'm just going to pick out a couple of the edges with the Model Air Steel, but this time with my brush. Because it's quite tricky for us to edge highlight or do anything like that on a clear scheme. Well, it's quite difficult once the colour is on, I should say. This is why we do it at this stage. Now I'm going to grab my Fleshtearers Red contrast paint, 1:1 with a thinner, and I apply about 3 coats of this until I've got a result I like. All the models are going to get a couple of coats of Vallejo polyurethane gloss varnish. So through the airbrush, thinned about 3 drops of thinner to varnish, and they get about 3 or 4 coats. Whatever gloss varnish you like, it's just to help break the surface tension for the next steps. And the next step is pin washing, and this is where I diverge quite a lot on the 3 models, because I thought it would be interesting to showcase the 3 different ways I tend to pin wash models or panel line them. So to some Sansador thinner, I'm adding Winsor & Newton Artist Oil Colour Payne's Grey, and I'm mixing it together, and I test it out on the side of the dish to see what the wash looks like. And if it's a bit weak, then I just mix in more of the oil that I've put in. You see, I don't mix the whole thing up in one go to begin with. It's a little bit more, and we're good to go. For the grey model, this is the pin wash we're using, so it's an oil pin wash. And we've done a video dedicated to pin washing, or panel lining you might hear it called, or recess washing, the different ways we can do it. But I thought it'd be nice to do a bit of an update and show you it on 3 models that, whilst not identical, are certainly very similar. Just work your way around the whole model. You can go over the red with this colour as well. For our turquoise warrior, we're going to use an enamel wash. In this case, it's a panel liner for grey and blue armour. I always like to add just a couple of drops of the Sansador thinner to this, doesn't need much. And again, we just work our way around the model exactly the same way. A lot of people ask about these little metal mixing dishes I use in these videos. If you just search metal mixing dish for paint, you should see them. If you can't get hold of them, you've just got a plastic palette like I have here. Just put some tin foil in there and you've got your own, and it's easier to clean as well. Our last pin wash, we're going to do an acrylic wash, and I'm going to use contrast Shyish Purple, and I added a couple of drops of a violet ink in there, scale 75 Inktense Violet. And then, just like the others, work my way around all the recesses. This one doesn't flow quite as well as the other two because it's a water base, not an alcohol base. There's a bit more tension there. But just like the others, if you need to wipe anything off, just get a Q-tip or your finger and you can remove it. Now here they all are. I left these all overnight. Obviously the acrylic one dries a lot quicker. I definitely like to leave the enamel ones to dry overnight. The oil ones, sometimes I will use a hairdryer to speed it up, but generally leave it overnight and then I bang a hairdryer on it before I carry on just to check it's okay. But you can see the different effect all three of those pin washes have given us. The enamel's quite a bit sort of dirtier, the acrylic was quite striking, and the oil was probably the most subtle. And they're all going to get a couple of coats of ultra matte varnish. To make our first chipping colour up, I've taken Vallejo model colour magenta and I've added a tiny little bit of ivory into that just to lighten it slightly. And I'm not going to traditionally edge highlight these models. If you like that effect, go and watch one of the GW tutorials or something where I'm sure they go over that. But we're sort of edge highlighting, but we're going to double up and use it to battle damage the miniature at the same time. And you see here effectively what I'm doing is taking a much brighter colour than the main armour colour and I'm sort of stippling it on in the areas that I think would take a little bit of damage, but also areas that I just want to draw attention to. Means we don't have to be super accurate, but we still get a very similar effect. You can put the odd little scratch in if you want as well. For the turquoise one, I've used AK Interactive Aquatic Turquoise. I'm doing exactly the same, just tapping it along those edges, creating the odd little scratch. And what this does is, coupled with that pin wash, it starts to bring a lot of definition to the model, so we can identify where the panels are, and we can reinforce those areas of light as well. And then for the grey one, I'm using GW Ulthuan Grey. So you can see in all three cases we went for a colour that's significantly lighter than that airbrush highlight. Now for the flayed skin that they've all got on them. First of all, I'm going to base coat it using Cadian Fleshtone. Couple of coats till we have a nice smooth base coat. Then I'm going to give it a very thin wash of Vallejo Panzer Aces Light Rust. You could use something like Rhinox Flesh Shade or Bugman's Glow, watered down, something like that. Now go back to my Cadian Fleshtone. And work on probably, I don't know, 3/4 or so. Just leaving that slightly darker colour where I don't think the light will hit it as much. Now I'm not worrying about being super smooth with this. I'm just drawing the brush vertically all the time. I quite want to start creating a little bit of texture on this now. Now I add in a little bit of Vallejo model colour basic skin tone to that Cadian mix, and then just work on a slightly smaller area. And I might change the angle that I start doing a few of these little scratches with, just to give it some texture, just to show it's not some smooth fabric. It's something quite a lot more sinister. And for the little bones, I'm going to base coat those using a Vallejo model colour US Olive Drab. And because I've got some ivory on my palette from the magenta mix we made earlier, I'm just going to add that into the olive brown and do a couple of highlights with that. And add a little bit more in and do another highlight. This is generally how I approach painting bone on most models. For our little leather pouches, we're going to base them on these models. I'm going to use GW Rhinox Hide, so a brown. I was really quite tempted to leave them black, as if they were maybe not leather, maybe made of something else. But we're doing some black bits on the rest of the model, so if you fancy doing these black, just use the recipe I use later on for the rifle. And then to lighten the brown up, I just added in a bit of the olive drab that was on my palette. And again, start stippling in the highlights. I say stippling, we're not necessarily using exactly the point of the brush as if we were stippling, just sort of tapping the brush against it. We don't mind if it creates a bit of texture. Add a little bit more of the olive drab. I think a bit of the ivory might have crept into the mix as well. Again, it doesn't really matter. It's just a slightly lighter tone. It helps bring a little bit of definition, a little bit of texture to the model. To highlight the rifle, as you noticed earlier, I base coated all the different parts in a black. It was Vallejo model colour black. And to highlight, I'm just using Vallejo model colour dark grey. For the silver parts of the model, I've grabbed some scale 75 black metal. The reason I grabbed this is it's a very dark silver colour, but it's also thick enough to have good control with the brush, so I wasn't worried about it wicking off the brush and going on other parts of the model. And I'm highlighting it with GW Leadbelcher. A lighter silver, but again, nice and thick, easy to control. For the bronzy, goldy, coppery coloured metal, I'm base coating it in one of my favourite paints, scale 75 Decayed Metal. Once it's dry, I'm giving it a very, very thin dilute wash of scale 75 Despair Green. Way too much on my brush there, so take the excess off and just move it around on the model. This paint has a very, very high saturation, very, very strong pigment, so we can thin it down loads. We can use it like a wash. It'll just age up that copper colour, that bronze colour rather. And then to highlight, I'm going to use P3 Blighted Gold. And then lastly, it's the eyes. I've done the same on all the models here. You paint them in white. I'd already base coated them black earlier that you saw. We just want it nice and bright near the centre. And then I've chosen a GW Warp Lightning contrast, so a green here. Play around with whatever colours you fancy really. I like the contrast paints for this sort of technique because they are usually a very vibrant saturated colour. We're just going to give the eye lenses a couple of coats of this. I've gone for green on all the models just for speed, but also because I knew the green would work with all the schemes. And I'm not worried if I get a little bit of that contrast outside the lens. And there they are all done. I've just popped them on our simple bases that we use for a lot of the YouTube videos. I hope you've enjoyed the video. I hope it was useful, particularly with that pin washing stage, to see the difference you get depending on what technique, well not technique, but what product you use, whether that's an enamel, an oil or an acrylic. And that from watching the video, even if you don't have the exact colours we use, you can make a plan, get that army painted and get it on the table. If you want to see some more advanced techniques or how myself and Andy paint our personal armies, consider checking out our Patreon. We go into a lot of depth, not just on masterclass things, but also how we approach doing our Age of Sigmar, 30k, 40k, and all the other game systems that we enjoy playing. So hit the like button, pop a comment down below, let us know what you think, and tell your friends. And I'll see you next time.